In case you didn't know. Okay.
I'm happy to introduce to everybody Brennan Breed, who has his doctorate. And so he comes very highly recommended by friends of ours and both of the pastors here at St. John's. So he's going to tell you a little bit about himself because he knows himself better than I do. And I think we're going to enjoy the series. And we're going to stop about 10 minutes before 8 o'clock so that we can ask questions. And if you are somebody online, you can ask through the chat.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So
I'll keep an eye in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Brennan.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks to everyone who's played a part in putting this on. So yeah, my name is Brennan Breed, and I teach Old Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. It's right next to Atlanta. It's one of the Presbyterian seminaries, and I've been teaching there for about 13 years. And before that, I was at Emory University, and I got a PhD from Emory in Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. And before that, I was at Princeton Theological Seminary where I did a master's. So I've been all over, but I've been doing Hebrew Bible for more than 20 years now, and I love teaching churches. So I'm just really grateful to see a whole bunch of folks on a Wednesday night who have chosen to come and learn about the Book of Daniel. So the plan for this is that we've got, of course, as you all know, several weeks on Daniel. I'm going to start today with an introduction to the book. Basically, the question like why would we learn about Daniel? What is Daniel about? And we'll take a look at chapter 1. Next, we'll take a look at chapter 3, which you might know is the fiery furnace, the 3 youth in the fiery furnace. And then the week after that, we're going to talk about the handwriting on the wall, which is a fun and interesting episode. And then we'll look at the lion's den. And then we're going to shift to the second half of the book of Daniel, which is really very, very different. And it's all about apocalyptic literature. So we're going to talk about apocalyptic literature. What is it? Why is this strange stuff in the Bible? You might be familiar with it from the book of Revelation, but also the Daniel chapters 7 through 12 are the other apocalyptic part of the Bible. So that's the basic idea. And I'll introduce why we would read these things. Why might they be important for us today? That'll be a big part of today's conversation. Let me start off by saying, please feel free to stop me at any time, ask questions. I might be able to see you or not see you, but I can hear you. So feel free to just interrupt. I will have some time for questions at the end, but I'm able to be wondering until the very end what we're on about. So let's open us in prayer, and then we'll get to our introduction to the book of Daniel. Is that okay? About your word, help us to hear your voice. Help us to sense your presence in this midst of ancient text. Lord, so as we leave this place, to see you at work in our lives today. Amen. All right, so let me share my screen, and I've got for this week I'll have a little presentation here. Here we go. Folks, see this? Good.
Yeah, it looks great. You're breaking up a little bit, but hopefully we'll get past that.
I'm breaking up like my internet.
You were during the prayer. Everything else was fine except during that one period.
Okay.
And Brennan, can you hear in the back okay? Yes. I can turn this up maybe a little bit. Okay. Okay. Sure. We're good, Brennan.
Let me put in my earphones because that might actually help. 1 second. That might actually help noise down a little bit, which might help. 1 second. Okay. Okay. Let's see. One second. Okay, can I can folks hear now? Is that
Yep,
all right?
fine, yep.
Oh, audio. Here we go. Okay, there we go. That might help with the background. Okay, great. Let me go back to my screen, and here we go. Okay. So this image, can you all see this image? This is Nippur. Nippur is a city that today would be in modern day Iraq. In the ancient world, this was Mesopotamia, the Greek word for the land between two rivers. But they would also have known this. Here's a picture of the ancient Near East. Let me go back to Nippur. This was a city, a very, very old city in Mesopotamia, in an area that was Sumeria or Sumer, the place where writing was invented. So writing was invented in Nippur or another town next to it, sometime around 3,300 BC. That city had existed for some 2,000 or 3,000 years before that. This city is incredibly old. In 597 BC, the prophet Ezekiel was brought to this city. What had just happened was that the city of Jerusalem had been sacked by the Babylonians. It was not yet fully destroyed. The temple was left standing. But Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, decided to punish Jerusalem for withholding their taxes. That's how they rebelled in the ancient world. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, sent his troops and destroyed the walls of Jerusalem and took the elite from the city of Jerusalem and deported them and took them to ancient Babylon and took them to the cities of Nippur and a couple other cities in the area. And a few of the elite he took to the city of Babylon. But most of the people from Jerusalem that were deported were actually brought to this area right here. And so this is what Ezekiel the prophet, one of that group in 597, who was one of the first of the deportees or the Judeans who were carried into exile, brought to Babylon. This is what he would have seen, this image right here. Now, Ezekiel, when he saw this site, this city right here, the people that he represented, the people of Judah, represented a country or a nation that was about 500 years old. It's actually less than that, maybe 400 years old, 500 years old. It's kind of a little bit hard for us to tell exactly when it would have started. But when Ezekiel saw this city, it was already about 4,500 years old. That is to say that Moses was only 500, 600 years before Ezekiel. The beginning of the people of Israel was only 500 or 600 years before the time of Ezekiel when he saw Nippur. But Nippur, this city, was 4,500 years older than that. The reason I show you this is to say that the people of ancient Israel were latecomers on the scene. When they emerged as a people after the time of the Exodus, the world was already ancient. There were cities that had been cities for 4,500 years by the time Moses was born. And as a result, we can say that the people of ancient Israel were part of this deep reservoir of culture from the ancient Near East that included all kinds of stories, all kinds of liturgies, all types of religious beliefs that would have been totally normal for the people of Israel. Now, remember, Israel began when God called Abram and Sarai, or later Abraham and Sarah, in Genesis 12, and called them to come to the land that we today would think of as Palestine or Israel. When Abraham and Sarah are called, they were Mesopotamian people. They came from Ur, which is not too far here from Nippur. They believed ancient Near Eastern things. They believed the things that people who were from Babylon would have believed. That was a normal part of their life and their culture. And slowly over time, the God of Israel began to communicate new and different things. So all to say that this ancient culture of the ancient Near East was rich and deep and pervaded everything about Israelite culture. Here, this is a map of the ancient Near East, the cultural context of ancient Israel. And you can see the parts in green. We might call that the Fertile Crescent. So there's the Nile Valley in Egypt, and it goes up the seaboard, the Eastern Mediterranean seaboard. That's the area where Jerusalem is, where Israel emerged. The Canaanite people lived there. But then also it goes up to the Euphrates River, and the Euphrates and the Tigris come down Mesopotamia. This area was well connected, and people traveled between it, like Abraham and Sarah wandered around. Abraham ends up going down into Egypt. So people moved between Egypt and Mesopotamia quite easily in the ancient world. It took a long time, and it was dangerous, but people still were able to move in this region. So there was a shared culture, shared cultural concepts, shared genres of literature. So it shouldn't surprise us that when we read Genesis 1, it sounds like an ancient Near Eastern creation story. And there are other creation stories from the ancient world that sound something like Genesis 1. It reminds us of them. So there's a Babylonian creation story called the Enuma Elish that it sounds a lot like Genesis 1, but there are really important differences. And it's when we can see these differences and these similarities that we can learn a lot about the Bible and about how God was communicating with those ancient folks, and then maybe how God is communicating with us today. So one important thing is that there are types of stories, right? There's today, if you go to the movies, you might see a comedy, you might see a drama, you might see a romantic comedy, right? You might see a horror movie. And it really is important before you go into the movie theater to know what kind of movie you're seeing, or you might be very surprised. So it just is in the same way in the ancient world, they had particular genres of literature. They had ancient comedies, they had ancient dramas, and the literature of the Bible, the literature that we know today as the Bible, was the literature of ancient Israel. Not all of it makes it into the Bible. It's a curated collection of ancient literature, but these stories were not just written out of thin air. And these texts like the prophetic literature, that's not, the ancient Israel is writing in genres that people would have recognized. There are ancient prophets everywhere throughout this ancient cultural context. You can see from Egypt to Mesopotamia. The Canaanites had prophets, the Mesopotamians had prophets, the Egyptians had prophets, and they all spoke in fairly similar ways. The content of what they said was different. So ancient Israel's prophets said different things, but they said them in similar ways to prophets of the surrounding culture. In the same way, the book of Daniel, we can see, is part of a larger genre of ancient literature. There were other ancient stories that sounded a lot like the stories we find in Daniel, especially chapters 1 through 6. And so that's going to be important. Another really important piece of information is that ancient Israel, let me go back actually to show you this. This is the kind of cultural context of Israel, but it's the political context too. Egypt was very powerful because of all the water from the Nile River that flooded regularly every year, created a massive harvest of grain every year, and so could support a lot of people. And when you get a lot of people in the ancient world, you get kings. And the kings are able to organize people into armies, and of course, there's taxation and so on. In Mesopotamia, they had the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers that were a little bit harder and more complicated to predict the flood than in Egypt. They were less regular, but they still brought lots of water, and they were able to build canals. These canals flooded what were until then desert areas, but turned them into vast farms. So in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, you had giant kingdoms that had lots of people. Jerusalem and Israel lies in the middle between, it's like a bridge, a land bridge between Egypt and Mesopotamia. And it gets just enough rain to be able to grow some crops, but not enough to really have a giant kingdom. It also doesn't quite get enough rain or enough. There's the Jordan River's tiny. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but the Jordan River is like a canal, really. It's small, pretty small. It's smaller than the Delaware River by a matter of several degrees, right? So it is a tiny little trickle of water. It is not enough to grow a huge amount of crops and to have a really giant, strong kingdom. So Jerusalem finds itself in between Egypt and Mesopotamia on a land bridge that's passable. You can find water there, but it's always going to be dominated by these two outside powers. So the history of ancient Israel is not a history of power and of control. It's a history of being controlled by larger forces that surround it. And we can see this in the history that we find in the Bible. For us to understand what's going on in the Bible, it really helps to understand the big like arcs of history that created the context in which the Bible arose. In the same way that it'd be really hard to understand the history of Pennsylvania without a little bit of information about the Revolutionary War and a little bit of information about who William Penn was and so on. That really helps to give you a sense even for what's going on today in Pennsylvania. So in the same way, when we look at the history of the ancient world, we see these massive kingdoms, Assyria and Babylon. Those are Mesopotamian powers. Assyria is the north of Mesopotamia. Babylon is the south of Mesopotamia. It's the same people, really. It's just which king is in control? Where does that king come from? So Assyria and Babylon are different kings, but they're the same region. And both of them extended their power into the area of Israel or Canaan and fought with Egypt as well. And then we see there's a big shift after Babylon, and Persia, which is further to the east than Mesopotamia, took power in the whole region and went all the way to Greece. And after that, of course, Alexander the Great came and changed everything. We'll get to him later. We'll get to him in a few weeks. But just to say, Assyria and Babylon are very powerful kingdoms that continued to dominate this area and really inflected the language of the Bible. We can see references to these Assyrian kings and then, of course, Babylonian kings, especially Nebuchadnezzar, who we'll have the chance to read about. Here's a little image of Nebuchadnezzar. This is cut from an actual jewel that was in the eye of a statue of Marduk, the god of Babylon. This was a giant statue that was in Babylon. It was destroyed. The jewel survived, so that, but it was created, and it says Nebuchadnezzar. This is a portrait of Nebuchadnezzar. It was put into the eye of the statue of the god, so that the god was always seeing Nebuchadnezzar, right? The god of Babylon had Nebuchadnezzar on his mind all the time. But this was destroyed in World War II. It was uncovered by a German team of archaeological researchers and brought back to Berlin, was destroyed in World War II. But this drawing still exists. But that's the guy Nebuchadnezzar. You will see him, his name sometimes in the Bible as Nebuchadrezzar in the book of Jeremiah. Neither of those are right, Nebuchadnezzar or Nebuchadrezzar. The guy's name was Nabu Ishkin Utsar. It's an Assyrian name, Babylonian name. But anyway, don't worry about that. But the story here, though, is that Babylon dominated this region, and they didn't really have a real empire. The Persians were the first real empire in the ancient world, where they actually knew what you were doing if they controlled you. The Babylonians didn't really know what everyone was doing. They had one giant army, and they roamed around and asked you for taxes, but it wasn't really taxes. It was like they just took money from you. It was like a mafia, right? So the mafia shows up at your door. They say, pay us some protection money, and then they go away. This was what happened here in the ancient world under the Assyrians and the Babylonians. They just had one giant army that moved around and took protection money. Judah got tired of sending money to this protection racket, and they decided to just not pay a few years. Now, this was okay for a while because Babylon had one giant army, and if everyone decides to revolt at the same time and just not pay their taxes, it takes a while to go from door to door and get everyone to pay up. And Judah was not that special, not that important as a kingdom. They were pretty small, and they were considered a cultural backwater. But the Babylonians still ended up taking their failure to pay taxes seriously, and in 597, the king Nebuchadnezzar arrived with his army and told the Judahites that they needed to pay their taxes, and they refused. They were waiting for the Egyptians. They had made a deal with the Egyptians to come and help them, and they thought Egypt was going to show up and destroy the Babylonian army. Well, they never showed up. And instead, Nebuchadnezzar surrounded Jerusalem, destroyed the wall, and took the people, the elites, out of the city. He executed a bunch of people and then took a bunch of other people as almost like hostages, took them over to Babylon and resettled them. That image that I showed you at first of Ezekiel at Nippur, Ezekiel was one of these guys that was the son of the high priest. He was in line to become the high priest of the temple of Jerusalem. He wasn't yet old enough to be ordained, but he was taken and then had a vision when he was taken to Babylon. So this right here, what you're looking at, is the Babylonian Chronicle. This is Nebuchadnezzar's own story that he wrote about this event in 597 BC, and he says, I destroyed the wall of Jerusalem and I took some captives, but I left the temple. I let the king. I took one of the kings hostage, took the king to Babylon. I made another person king and one of his brothers king in his stead, and told him, "Don't you dare revolt again." 10 years later, in 587, there's another revolt. Judah doesn't pay their taxes again. This time, when Nebuchadnezzar comes back, he decides to destroy the whole city, destroy the temple, to make it an example so that nobody rebels again like that. And this is what we know of as the exile, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. From 587, the destruction of the temple, all the way to 539. There's no temple. Jerusalem is left as a heaping, smoking pile of rubble. And there are many, many people who are taken into Babylon. After 539 BC, Cyrus, the king of Persia, conquers Babylon and decides to send everyone home. There are other peoples from other nations that had been taken in exile to Babylon. They were sent home with money, or at least they were given the option of going home with money and with resources to rebuild their temples. Cyrus, the king of Persia, did this so that he could get their support. He wanted them to not rebel again. So he wanted to be the good guy. We see this happen in the Bible. This is the restoration of the temple, the rebuilding. This is the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and also some of the other prophets like Haggai. But all to say, and that's the temple that was around still, rebuilt a couple of times and expanded, especially by King Herod, that Jesus knew. So what we're going to be looking at during this series is really this book of Daniel that was written during this exilic period and into the post-exilic period, after the time of the Persians. The Persians are mentioned in Daniel. Daniel works for one of the Persian kings. But it's actually not a book of the exile so much as it is a book of what we call diaspora. I'll get to that in a moment. Okay, this is, by the way, just a cool thing. Jehoiachin was the king of Judah who was taken into exile by Nebuchadnezzar that first time, and he was kept in Babylon as almost like a display. Right here, I'm so powerful. Here's a king that I took. And I conquered his city of Jerusalem. He was rebelling, and I took him here. And for some reason, at the end of the book of Kings, says, it's Second Kings, it says that King Jehoiachin was let out of prison by King Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar decided he was happy with the king of Judah for some reason, who was in prison. Let him out of prison, let him hang out in the palace, and gave him like some really nice, comfortable rations. Like gave him some good food every day. This is actually the ration tablet discovered by that German team that dug up the ruins of Babylon in the 20th century. And they found this tablet. Those are inscriptions on there. And those inscriptions describe this lavish amount of food that was given to King Jehoiachin of Judah while he lived in Babylon. So what does it mean? We don't really know exactly, but for some reason, Nebuchadnezzar liked this guy. Does it have something to do with Daniel? We don't know, but it's tantalizing. But one thing I want us to think about is imagine you are a resident of Jerusalem at the time of the destruction. This picture that you see here, this is from Rome, and this is a picture of the second destruction of the temple. Those are Roman soldiers you see carrying that thing there is the menorah from the temple. This is on the Arch of Titus, which is on the Forum in Rome. If you go to Rome today, you can see this. This was made in 70 AD, the destruction of the temple that Jesus foretold. So the Romans they went into the temple when they destroyed Jerusalem for another rebellion. They went into the temple and they were looking for a statue of a god. They like to take statues of gods and take them back to Rome and parade them around to show they conquered them. But they couldn't find a statue of a god in the Jewish temple because there were no statues of Yahweh. So they found the menorah. They were like, maybe they worship a tree. I don't know. So they grabbed this thing and they paraded it around Rome and they made an image of it. But nonetheless, imagine that you are a resident of Jerusalem. You have been told that Jerusalem is a special city chosen by God, that the Davidic king, the kings that descend from David, are special kings that God has promised. And in 2 Samuel 7, God promises to David that I will be with you and your descendants all times. I will protect Jerusalem. This is found throughout the Psalms. God promised to David to protect David. God promised to Jerusalem to protect Jerusalem. Imagine that you live in Jerusalem and you think this city is impervious because Yahweh has said so. And that king will always be on the throne, or that king's son, because Yahweh said so. And then one day, Nebuchadnezzar breaks down the walls, takes the things out of the temple, burns it to the ground. What might we ask? What kinds of questions might occur to us? I can think myself. I might have some serious questions. Why would God allow this? What actually happened? Why did this happen? Did I make this happen? Right? Is this my fault? Or did God want this to happen? What was that? Who are these people who did this, right? But when might we go home? Or will we ever be allowed to go home? When will Yahweh, our God, take us back? Or will Yahweh ever do that? Where is our home now? There's no home left. They burned Jerusalem to the ground. Now I've been taken to Babylon. Where is my true identity found? If they let me go home, where would I even go to? Would I go to that burned out city? Who are we now that Yahweh has left us? Should we just become Babylonians? And by the way, there's a reason that there are no Hivites or Jebusites or Moabites anymore. You can't find any people who call themselves Ammonites. You can't find any people who call themselves Canaanites anymore. They don't exist. What happened to them? Where are the Philistines today, right? There's Palestine, but the people there call themselves, Gazans or, Arabs, Palestinians. But these cultures, Phoenicians, right? What happened to all of these people? Well, what happened to all those ancient nations? They didn't all die. They assimilated into other cultures. And this is a real question. If you believe that a foreign power took you over and destroyed your city, knocked it to the ground, took your god, the statue, right, and paraded it around, and now I don't know, they own your god or something, or maybe your god didn't ever exist. Maybe your god died or got killed. People in the ancient world said all those different things in response to being destroyed. So the question then is, really, who are we? And most ancient peoples ended up assimilating into larger, more powerful cultures that destroyed their political system, and they just became whoever conquered them. So that other question of how, if God was to rebuild Jerusalem, how in the world would that happen? So that is to say, all these questions were live questions, and we know that people didn't have answers to them. The book of Lamentations is a real short book written by people who lived in Jerusalem or nearby Jerusalem, and looked at the rubble of the temple. And they managed to stay behind in the land. The Babylonians didn't take them. They didn't take everyone. So the book of Lamentations was written by people who were weeping after the destruction of the temple. And the book ends with these series of questions. Would you ever take us back? Would we take you back? I don't know. That is to say that people at the time did not know the eventual answers. And the book of Daniel is written really as a response, especially the first 6 chapters, were written as a response to this particular historical crisis. And one thing I think is important is it addresses universal questions, but through this very specific time and place. So, you can think of any kind of time of devastation, right? After World War I, after World War II, today, I've seen images of Gaza that look pretty destroyed. That is to say that these times where you can think like everything is gone, who are we now? What are we now? Daniel avoids the destruction a bit. Daniel's taken before Jerusalem's destroyed, but Daniel knows that Jerusalem is gone, and so he has to deal with all these questions. The books that were written during this time, like Esther, which is Esther being in the Persian court, the book of Daniel, we got some other pieces of different books. People have noticed that the parts of the Bible written during this time seem to imagine God as difficult to find, far away, distant. Whereas if you think about the story of the Exodus, God's right there, like God's in the cloud, following them around or going out in front of them. God shows up to wrestle Jacob in the Jacob story, right? God's there, God's present physically somehow. In this period, during, and after the time of the exile, ancient Israelites or Jews, this is the time where we start to use that word Jews. Different historians and biblical scholars do that differently, but in any event, people call this post-exilic Judaism. These stories tend to kind of imagine God being more remote, harder to find, because where was God? The book of Esther is famous because it's the only book, besides Song of Songs perhaps, to not mention God once. Kind of amazing. The name Esther is a Hebrew verb that means I will be hidden. And I think it's a name of God, right? God is hidden in the book of Esther, but God is still at work. So this idea of the God of providence, the God who works mysteriously, remotely behind things. And we see that kind of God appear in Daniel. There are times where God's presence or activity is to be found, but a lot of Daniel is about the mystery of God, and that Daniel can't figure it out by thinking hard enough. Instead, God has to reveal things to Daniel in mysterious ways like dreams or through mysterious kind of codes and things. But this is that historical context that led to this idea of the feeling that God might not be so present. Okay, one other big issue to talk about before we jump into the book of Daniel is this issue of exile. So, exile is a word we use to mean that somebody is going to come back, right? I've been exiled, but like I want to go home. I'm waiting, kind of pining to go home, right? Uh, uh, Immigration is different because an immigrant leaves their home voluntarily, we imagine, right? And chooses to go to a new place and wants that to become their home. They might want to retain parts of their identity, but it's more of a sense of desiring to become something else or going to a new home where you might try to fit in some way, also while retaining parts of one's home identity. A diaspora situation is different from both of those. In the diaspora, people aren't pining to go home, but kind of waiting for something to change, like a political change, to be able to go home. So there might be people who call themselves Cuban exiles. They're waiting for the political system to change so they can go home. Diaspora is different. You might talk about the Puerto Rican diaspora in New York City. There's a huge Puerto Rican neighborhoods, and they're not waiting for something to change to go home to Puerto Rico, but they also don't consider themselves to be immigrants the way that some immigrants think of it. That is to say that there's an effort to retain some of one's own identity and culture in a palpable way, to stick out from the surrounding cultures around you and to keep contact with other groups of people from that culture in the midst of a diaspora. Kind of a diaspora is a Greek word meaning to spread seed, to be spread around. And the first diaspora that's successful is really the Jewish diaspora after the exile. Jews went all the way into southern Egypt and northern Sudan. They went to Greece, they went to Spain, they went into Central Asia, and they wrote letters to each other and they kept contact. Even before the Bible was written, the Jews were keeping contact with one another and trying to kind of retain some sense of cultural and religious theological identity. So, all to say that this diaspora is what we're talking about with the book of Daniel and with the book of Esther. And these diaspora stories find their way, particularly to us, in what's called court tales. So you think about Esther, you think about Daniel. Another good example is the book of Nehemiah. These are stories about Jews that find themselves in the court of an important foreign king or foreign dignitary. And they face all these tensions because they want to get ahead in the world that they live in, right? They want to be like important dignitaries in within the bureaucratic system that they're working, but they also want to retain their identity. They don't want to just assimilate. So Daniel, Esther, Nehemiah, they all are Jews. Esther's hiding it, but she reveals it at an important moment. She retains that Jewish identity despite the pressures for people to assimilate. This also, for all of these characters, makes them stick out, makes them targets for people who are from the dominant culture and might resent them for getting ahead and leapfrogging them, right? Like Daniel gets threatened all the time because he manages to succeed and move his way up the bureaucracy and retain his Jewishness. So these court tales don't just exist in ancient Israel. These court tales were found in other cultures as well that themselves experienced diaspora spreading around, although to a much smaller degree than the ancient Jews. One of these books is called Ahikar, and it's about a Syrian guy from Syria, just north of Israel. And he finds himself displaced and in Egypt. And he has to find his way in the court of Pharaoh and survive. It sounds a lot like the Joseph story. and it ends with like a bunch of proverbs, kind of like the book of Proverbs. All to say that these court stories aren't unique, aren't fully unique, but the way that Jewishness works in these stories or identity works in these stories is unique. Ahikar tries to fit in, doesn't try to keep his Syrian identity at all. He doesn't really care. He doesn't stick out in any way. He tries to just become an Egyptian bureaucrat. But Daniel, Esther, Nehemiah, they retain their Jewishness, and it sometimes can be a troublesome thing. One thing about identity is you got to do things to mark your identity. If you want to make a house, you have to make a distinction between the house and the outside. You got to build a wall. If you want to distinguish your identity as a Puerto Rican, you got to wear particular clothes, maybe a Puerto Rican flag, on a t-shirt or something. People say, okay, I get you. I see that. Or you might mark yourself with the kind of food you eat, or you might mark yourself with the way you speak, or you might mark yourself with the kinds of music you listen to, or the kinds of decorations you have in your home. That is to say, people do things to mark their identity. And Jews do this in the ancient world as well, and in the modern world. Jews are famous for going out of their way to wear tassels, or at least Orthodox Jews, right, wear tassels in the corners of their garment. The men wear kippahs. That is to say that there's signals, right, about identity. And food. Food has been a major signal of people's identity since time immemorial. But for ancient Jews, there's these rules about food that have often been kind of very distinguished. So it's a kosher food that we might think of today, right? The book of Daniel's interesting in this way. Esther doesn't care about food, really. She eats the food of the king and she doesn't ever ask questions. But Daniel, he's got an issue with food. We'll get to that in a minute. This is W.E. Du Bois. He is an African-American, maybe the first sociologist, actually, but an African-American scholar from the early 20th century. And one of his essays in The Souls of Black Folk, he writes about double consciousness. And that's this idea that African-Americans and the African-American experience in the United States has often been one of having a kind of a normal consciousness, like a consciousness where I'm conscious of myself, but then this second or double consciousness where one is always reflecting upon how other people are seeing you. So as a white man in America, I don't typically think about who I am as a white man in America. I just exist. I'm not always thinking about how other people perceive me as a white guy. I just am. But what W.B. Du Bois perceived and wrote about this tendency of African Americans, and it's a self-preservation tendency to always be thinking, how might this other person from the dominant culture be seeing me and thinking about me, and what assumptions might they be making about the way that I'm acting? And often this is associated with safety, right? That is to say that like the safety of African Americans in the history of America has often been at the mercy of white Americans and how they perceive African Americans. So all to say, this double consciousness, this sense that people have to be thinking about who they are, this is typical of minority groups within majority dominant cultures. And the book of Daniel and Esther are constantly thinking about this particular issue. So there's many ways we can think about double consciousness. Many women might say, like in the business world, right, that one has to always be thinking about gender, whereas the men aren't thinking about gender as much in the boardroom, let's say. So all to say that this is something we'll see come up again and again in the book of Daniel. Okay, so Daniel is a book in two genres. Like I said, chapters 1 through 6, that's those court tales. But then in chapter 7, everything changes. We all of a sudden change, and what we get for the rest of the book through chapter 12 is apocalyptic visions, which we'll get to later, but those are fun and strange. So we're going to focus for the next few weeks on the diasporic stories or the court tales of Daniel 1 through 6. And these were written, we think, starting in the Babylonian period, in the exilic period, but they were touched up, edited, kind of collected, put together, and the last touches were put on in the 3rd century BC, we think. That is to say, right at the time of Alexander the Great, who is mentioned in the book of Daniel. Languages. Daniel is strangely not written all in Hebrew. Most of the Old Testament's written in Hebrew. Daniel has a large section written in Aramaic, which was like the business language of the ancient world, especially in with the time of the Persian kings. So Daniel is written in almost like the international business language, kind of like the New Testament, which was written in Koine Greek or Common Greek. It was written in business Greek. rather than in Hebrew or in Aramaic, the language of probably a lot of the earliest followers of Jesus, so that it could be accessible to lots of people in lots of different places. So a diasporic book like Daniel, written so that Jews around the world could read it, was written in this very accessible business language, kind of like the New Testament was written in accessible Greek. Kind of, it's like the middle chapters. All these chapters we'll be reading. Chapter one's written in Hebrew, and then it switches to Aramaic, and then it switches back to Hebrew at the end. We'll get back to language in a few weeks when we talk about apocalyptic literature. But the one major question that ties everything together in all of the book of Daniel, those two parts, the court stories and the apocalyptic, there's one major question is, how do we, and this is a question posed to ancient Jews, but it could be posed to people today, how do we simultaneously, number one, live under an evil foreign king? Nebuchadnezzar was not seen positively in a positive light at all. And this could be replicated for Persian kings, which are typically seen in a decent light in the Old Testament, but I'm sure that people would have perceived them as being, like in the book of Esther, potentially very harmful and potentially even evil. So how do we live under these oppressive foreign regimes? And how do we, number two, retain our identity? So in the midst of this, we're a minority group in the midst of a majority culture that is not looking out for the benefit of the minority group. How do we retain our identity as a minority group? And while we retain our identity, we don't stick out so much that we get excluded or even killed. So how do you stick out just enough to retain your identity, to retain what it means to be Jewish, but not stick out so much that you stick your neck out and people get angry and try to kill you? In the book of Daniel, this happens again and again. They cross that line. And yet, how do we go through all of that and still keep faith in Yahweh's sovereignty? Say that Yahweh is in power. And the book of Daniel uses that word, sovereignty, more than any other book in the Old Testament. And the reason is Daniel is all about power. It's about the question, is God really in power? Everything shows us, everything your eyes can see and your ears can hear tell you that God is not in power, right? Everything has gone to chaos. The temple is destroyed. The prophets have all been killed. The king of Judah is being held in prison in Babylon, maybe being fed well, but that's it. How can we possibly say that God is in charge when the world is in shambles? Daniel is an attempt to say just this. So, last little slide here. There's a bunch of themes as well. So themes, we can say, kind of go along with this big question, the big theme of Jewish identity in the diaspora, and the questions of what can we change, what's possible to change, and then what must we not change to retain our identity? Like where's the line drawn, right? What's bendable, what's not bendable? And then how do we retain faithfulness while working in the court of a foreign king? Daniel doesn't have a choice. He just gets put to work working for the king. But how do we do this faithfully, both to God and to the foreign king, at least enough that we don't get killed? This theme of sovereignty, the sovereignty of Yahweh in the midst of a world that does not seem to resonate with this idea of God's sovereignty or show us evidence of it. And third, Yahweh as a source of mysterious wisdom, this distant, hidden God. These themes come up again and again. 6 chapters of Daniel. So I'm going to start with Daniel chapter 1 right now. I'm going to click off here. Here's Daniel refusing to drink the wine. How are we doing? We okay?
Yep.
You all have questions now before I'm gonna give us a quick reading of Daniel chapter 1, and I think it's pretty interesting. But before I get there, any thoughts or questions, concerns?
No, I don't see any hands going up right now.
Great. Do you all see any resonance with some of these themes today? Does anyone struggle with some of these questions, or do you know folks who do?
I think you hit the nail on the head at the end.
Great. Just what I'm looking for. Okay, so I'll keep going, and then I'll stop for questions again at the end. Okay, so the book of Daniel begins. Chapter 1, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah. That's the guy you saw that ration tablet, right? In the 3rd year of that guy's reign, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord, that is the God of Israel, Yahweh, let King Jehoiakim of Judah fall into his power, as well as some of the vessels of the house of God. That's the temple. So some of that stuff, remember you saw the guy carrying the menorah? The menorah is just a big lampstand in the temple. It's, the source of light, but it's supposed to be beautiful and it's supposed to represent God's presence. The light that God's physical, spiritual presence would have shined for us, the illumination of God. Notice this, you might just read these first couple of sentences and say, okay, that means King Jehoiakim got taken away captive and Jerusalem got destroyed, but it was not destroyed yet. This is the first destruction of the walls of Jerusalem. But the temple is still okay. It's just been sacked and many of the things have been taken from it. But notice this, it's actually a real subtle theological explanation of what happened. How is it possible that Yahweh is still in power if the temple was sacked and if the king has been taken away and the walls of Jerusalem are destroyed? How is it possible that Yahweh is still in power? It doesn't that show that Yahweh's weak? Yahweh got beaten in battle by Marduk, the god of Babylon, that Nebuchadnezzar is stronger than God? Well, this second little sentence there, the Lord let King Jehoiakim of Judah fall into his power. So the idea here is that God distantly allows this horrible thing to happen. And the rest of the book of Daniel is really asking that question, why? Why would God have allowed that? I'm going to spoil the ending, I'm sorry. But the rest of the Bible, much of the rest of the Bible, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, many of these prophets of the exile, the book of Deuteronomy foreshadows this, explains the exile by saying the people were sinful and they deserved it. We can get to that some other time. But for now, just notice that the book of Daniel, chapters 1 through 6, that talk about the stories of Daniel and his friends, do not make that argument once. The book of Daniel, chapters 1 through 6, never say they deserved it. They did something to deserve it. Instead, God is doing something by allowing this tragedy. Later, we'll see that what God has actually done is spread abroad the people of Jerusalem. And in the book of Daniel, chapters 1 through 6, Daniel and his friends don't change that much. They seem to be the same guys that they were at the beginning of the story. They got some new names. That's all they got. The person who changes in Daniel chapters 1 through 6, if we read them closely, we'll see this over the next couple of weeks, is the king. The king is the one who changes. The king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, is the one who changes. The book of Daniel makes an argument that it doesn't say this is the only reason that the exile happened, etc. It just says one of the things that happened, one of God's deeper providential plans that had to do with this spreading abroad of people, the diaspora, is the spreading abroad of the knowledge of God. This foreshadows Jesus and it foreshadows Paul. Paul draws upon these arguments in his own theological thought that we see, let's say, in Romans. This idea that God, this kind of, the people have been spread abroad and the message is going to be spread abroad and it's going to have some real impact in the world. This does require people who love God to be put in terrible situations with people who have power over them who are not to be trusted. So it's a dangerous thing, but nonetheless, this is the subtle argument here. We'll get to that later as well. So verse 3, then the king commanded some of his palace master Ashpenaz, this is like a royal official, to bring some of the Israelites of the royal family and of the nobility, young men without physical defect and handsome, versed in every branch of wisdom, endowed with knowledge and insight, and competent to serve in the king's palace. So go find me the smartest kids, and we're going to take them, we're going to make them work here. And this is an assimilation thing. These people would be expected to become Babylonians. And the Babylonians did this, just like lots of ancient cultures would. And in fact, it's happened recently, too. I heard about actually Vladimir Putin. The Russians, when they invaded Ukraine, actually took a bunch of Ukrainian kids. There's still thousands of Ukrainian kids that were just taken and are being raised by folks. And I guess they were just given to foster families. And that is to say, this is a thing that happens in war. So these kids, smart kids, promising kids, are just taken, and they're to be raised in the royal palace, and they're to be taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans. What this means really is that they're going to be taught all this like wise stuff that ancient Babylonian scholars would have known. This is like divination. They would have been doing like astrology. Like this is what the Babylonians did. So Daniel learns astrology. He learns ancient divination. He learns how to read tea leaves. Really, they used sheep livers most of the time. But he memorized all these ancient Babylonian spells and stuff. He had to learn all this stuff. Now notice that Daniel doesn't say no. He's like, fine, I'll learn your weird lore. I'll learn your skills. The king then assigned them a daily portion of the royal rations of food and wine. This is really good food and expensive wine that these guys are going to get. The king wants them to have good brain food, right? Then they were to be educated for 3 years so that at the end of the time they could serve and they could be stationed and serve in the king's court. So the king wants them to do, difficult jobs, mental jobs for the king. Among them were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah from the tribe of Judah. Palace master gave them other names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. So Belshazzar, we'll see in chapter 5, that's a common Babylonian name. Belteshazzar doesn't work as a Babylonian name. It's actually supposed to be maybe funny. It's like supposed to be a mockery of these people. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Again, it's like sounds like a Babylonian name, but it's not right. Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. That's kind of a weird way to say servant of Nebo, so the god Nebo, Babylonian god. We think this might be making fun of the way these people talked, or they're making fun of the way they spoke. So it's like mocking their accent, giving them a name that literally is supposed to sound funny to the Babylonians. And Daniel and his friends say, okay, fine. I mean, call me what you want. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the royal rations of food and wine. This is where Daniel draws the line. He'll learn their language, he'll learn their culture, he'll get called whatever they want to call him, he'll go to their schools, but he's not going to eat the food. Now, Esther eats all the king's food. So this is Jews during this time were coming up with rules for themselves. Daniel decides to keep kosher. Esther doesn't and isn't apparently in trouble for it. But Daniel says this food is good. I'm going to draw the line. I want to keep my Jewish food practices. Now, God assigned Daniel to receive favor and compassion from the palace master. Now, notice the palace master is given the responsibility for making sure that these kids are fed well and are healthy and happy and learning a lot, right? They're doing good in school. So they got the free lunch program, right, to help them learn in school. And Daniel doesn't want to eat the food. Palace master, verse 10, says to Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king. The king gave me a job for you to eat good food and be healthy and happy and awake during classes. You better eat the food, right? I'm afraid of my lord the king. He has appointed your food and your drink. If I should give you in poorer condition than the other young men your own age, that would endanger my head with the king. Notice though, he does not say no. He doesn't say no. He just says, if you look, that endangers me. And he leaves it there. Daniel then goes to ask the guard. This is like the lower level guy, the guy who like puts the food in front of his room. Daniel asks that guy a question. He says, please test your servants for 10 days. Just give us the vegetables and the water. Now, this isn't like a diet or something. This was presumed to be like bad for you to eat vegetables in the ancient world. It's fine to eat vegetables, but in the ancient world, they really did think that if you ate only vegetables all the time, it was like it would make you vulnerable to disease. So Daniel is putting himself at risk here. He's endangering himself because he doesn't want to have the king's food. Daniel asks this lower level palace guard, just give us the vegetables. I don't want your wine. I don't want your meat. Then you can compare us and our appearance with the appearance of the other young men who eat the royal rations after 10 days. And if we look worse, then you can make us eat the food. But if we look just fine, then you can let us keep ignoring the meat and the wine. Now, first of all, this is the world's first control group. Not kidding. So all the other kids are getting fed all the good food. Daniel and his companions get fed just vegetables, and they check after 10 days. This is the world's oldest science experiment. Also, that this is a strange thing for this guy to do. Why would the palace guard, this low-level guard, why would he endanger his own head and the palace master's head, his boss? Why would he endanger himself this way? Because what happens to the meat and the wine? In a couple of verses we learn the palace guard gets to keep it. And he takes it home to his family. So Daniel is being really wise here, really subtle. He gets the head nod from the palace master who says, just don't let me know. And then he works out something very subtly with the palace guard where he never says you can have the food and sell it yourself or eat it with your family and have the wine. But he subtly says, why don't you do whatever you want with the wine? And I'll just not eat it for 10 days. And then if it's worse, if I look worse, then you make me eat the food. Really smart. What this is trying to do is trying to be a lesson, really, for Jews who are trying to get along in this culture. How do you actually get what you want? How do you negotiate with these folks in such a way that they don't hear you say the wrong thing and you pick up on subtle clues from them so that you can retain your Jewish identity in ways that don't endanger yourself and don't endanger those who you need to help you in the administration? At the end of the 10 days, they were doing better than all the other young guys. So the guard, verse 16, continued to withdraw the royal rations. He continued to take them home and eat them or sell them himself, and he gave them the vegetables. To these four young men, God gave knowledge and skill in every aspect of literature and wisdom, and Daniel had insight into visions and dreams. Now, notice here, they didn't study so hard and become so smart. They did. I'm sure they studied hard and got smart, but it's saying that there's special knowledge that only really God has access to. And Daniel and his friends, to get this access to this special knowledge, they have to pray. They have to pray. That's the only way that they're actually going to ever figure out what is actually going on in the world. And I think this is a message to those ancient Jews too. It's a message to say, you can't just look at history and figure everything out. You can figure a lot of things out. You can't just look at the stars and at science, right? A lot of their work was to like chart stars, and the Babylonians were really good at charting stars. They actually planned out all of the eclipses in what is now Iraq until 1950 AD. So in the year 3000 BC, the Mesopotamians figured out where all the eclipses were going to occur in Iraq for the next 4,000 years, 5,000 years. So they were smart, really, really smart. They were good at math. But this is telling you that there are really important things about the meaning of history and about where God is present in the world that you can't just figure out through science, through history, through your intelligence. There are things you have to pray to know. And it's not like they're not praying to figure out how to learn how to learn Chaldean language, so, Babylonian. You got to study the books for that. God's not going to give you a download of another language just magically, unless it's Pentecost. But that's one day, right? But here we see that Daniel has to study their language for 3 years to get it. God's not just going to snap the divine fingers and give you all the information. But there's special information, especially about where God is to be found in the chaos of history, that can only really be found through prayer. We're going to come back to this. We're going to come back to these same themes. These same. I'll kind of start us again next week by reminding us of some of these themes. But then we're going to look at chapter 3, which has a really important message about what happens when danger arises, when people threaten us because of, or we find ourselves in dangerous situations because we want to hold on to particular important aspects of our theological, religious identity, our moral and ethical identity. What happens when the powers of the world seem at odds with God? Okay, I'll stop there. Any questions, comments? I know I went a little bit late, sorry, but thoughts? Any rejoinders?
So,
Yes,
to a little bit more to the beginning part, and this goes back to my Western Civ courses in college, that the exile was a time where the Western world developed as God is not in a place, that the Jews up to that point saw God in the temple, and when the temple was destroyed, they had to come up with a new theory, or is that still thought today?
Yeah, we actually think it was even before the temple was destroyed. But what we can see is that there were different understandings of God's body in the ancient world, in ancient Israel. And there are certain texts written by certain authors that really do conceive of God having like a physical body, kind of like the wrestling of God with Jacob. And then there's other texts we can see that really move away from that and start to even ask deep questions of it. The book of Deuteronomy and some other texts that were deeply influenced by the book of Deuteronomy, like the book of Kings, reflects and quotes from Deuteronomy all the time. Deuteronomy and other books influenced by Deuteronomy are very critical of the idea that God has a corporeal body stuck in the temple somewhere, and they ask questions about this. One of the prayer in 1 Kings 8, when Solomon builds the temple, and he has this big long prayer to consecrate the temple. Remember, David brought the ark up into Jerusalem and danced his dance, but it was still in a tent. It was in the tabernacle, and it was Solomon who built the temple. When Solomon builds the temple and he moves it in, he says this mobile ark, the ark of the covenant, was a big throne. It was like a mobile throne You can move it around where Yahweh, the God of Israel, was invisibly enthroned upon the cherubim, these creatures, these kind of divine creatures that were on top of the mobile throne. So there's to say that Yahweh was understood to be there invisibly. And so when the Ark of the Covenant goes into the temple, Solomon says, is it really true that God is inside the temple? No, clearly God is too big to be in the temple. God is too big to be contained even in the highest heaven of heavens, Solomon says. And then he says, I actually think that the name of God is in the temple. And this is found in Deuteronomy. This is found in the book of Jeremiah. And this is what we call the name theology. The idea that the name of God is representing God's presence. And that's what's inside the temple. God is to be found outside of this world. God is found on some other plane of reality, external to the cosmos. And this is really only found in Deuteronomy and other thinkers influenced by Deuteronomy up until the late exilic time. So there was competing ideas we can see about the presence of God and what God's corporeality was like. And we can see these even in the New Testament. These kind of some different understandings of what was going on in the temple. There was a conflict even then about that. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Brennan, do we have any homework, or would there be anything?
Great question. Great question. How about if you want to read Daniel 1, you can go back through and read it again and take a look at the things I was pointing out, but also Daniel 1 and then Daniel 3. The story of the three youth in the fiery furnace. That's going to be what we look at closely next week. And you can take a look and see what, if you can predict a bit what I'm going to talk about, but also you can bring questions. Does that help?
Yes.
If you want to see a very different story with very different idea of what faith is like as a Jew in a foreign kingdom, take a look at Esther if you have time. Esther's a great story. It's a little complicated at the end, but it is a different way of understanding how God is active in the lives of those who have been displaced.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Good.
And feel free to bring questions next time. I'll start by saying, hey, I have any questions? So you might go home and tomorrow you might say, what did he say there? I'll begin with questions next time as well.
And should we have a Bible for next week?
You feel free to have it. You can also, if you have a cell phone that has a Bible app or something, or on the website for your cell phone, you can track along. I usually use the NRSV, but plenty of Bible translations are great. And if you have a different translation that has something interesting that is a different English translation, always feel free to bring that up, and I can try to explain. Some of the differences mean a lot and are important.
Thank you.
So shall we
So
say
you
good
have no
night?
other questions? I guess? Good. Well, have a good week. We thank you very much. And
Well, thank you. Yeah. And I appreciate you all taking the time. Again, feel free to ask questions. And I have sent the PowerPoint that I showed today. I've sent that to Jim, and perhaps Jim can send it out to the group as well.
I'll try to get it uploaded to the website, and if so, I'll
Great.
make sure everybody's got the link.
Great. Thanks very much, Jim.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Brennan.
Thank you. Thanks, Virginia. Thanks, everybody. Peace, y'all. Have a good night.
Good night.